Now, one thing that Helge Haugane just said, which I think I, as an Indian, would totally agree with, is that this transition is going to be just. And how do we make that happen? Well, our next speaker is an economist. He is Professor Knut Einar Rosendahl from the School of Economics and Business at NMBU. And he has been scrutinizing, amongst other things, another bit of EU climate policy, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Yes, they're so beautiful, these terms, aren't they? The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. And he's going to talk to us about some of its implications. Professor.
So, thank you for the invitation. So, here's my slides. So I'm going to talk about Europe as a front runner in climate policy and the challenges of being a front runner. So, as you know, we have the Paris Agreement, where more or less all countries in the world have sort of agreed to reduce their emissions of CO2. But still, we have a situation where the climate policies in the world is very different. And especially the price of CO2 in the world is very different. It's much higher in Europe than in most other parts of the world. So in EU, for instance, we have the EU emission trading system, where we have a price of CO2 of close to 100 euro per ton of CO2. In other parts, most other countries in the world, the price is much, much lower, like 10 euro or even 0. And there are many problems with this. One problem is, of course, that there is too little effort in the world to reduce emissions of CO2. And another problem is that the climate policy in the EU is partly undermined by the lack of CO2 pricing in other parts of the world. And then we are talking about carbon leakage. So when companies in Europe, in the EU, has to pay for their emissions, while companies in the rest of the world hardly have to pay anything, then of course the European companies, they lose in competitiveness. And this is especially the case for so-called emission-intensive and trade-exposed sectors such as steel, cement, aluminium, etc., which are trading a lot and also have quite high emissions. So the challenge for the EU and for Norway and for Europe is how can we combine high CO2 prices, which are important for the green transition, but still avoid or at least reduce the carbon leakage. So in the EU, we have the EU emission trading system. So companies that are regulated by this system, they have to acquire emission allowances. One allowance for every ton of emissions that they have. And this, of course, is a cost to these companies. In the EU, from the start, the EU has been giving out free emission allowances to the firms, especially because of the risk of carbon leakage. And the way this works is that the more you produce, the more emission allowances you get. Not the same year, but in future years. So in a way, these free allowances works almost like an implicit subsidy to production. So in a way, you have a combination of a price on CO2 emission and a subsidy to produce. So this gives companies incentives to stay in Europe, but it also gives them incentives to reduce their emissions intensity. So if you are able to, for instance, reduce your emissions without reducing your production, you get the same number of emission allowances as before, which is very valuable, but you don't need as many as before, so you have a surplus of allowances which you can then sell in the market. So this gives incentives to reduce emission intensities, which is good. There's also another compensation scheme in the EU called compensation for higher electricity prices, which is up to each country to decide. So in Norway, there's several billion kroner going out every year to companies like aluminium companies, for instance. But now the EU wants to change from free allowances to something called CBAM. So CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And you can think of this as almost like a carbon tariff. So this will gradually replace free allowances over some years. Initially, it will only apply to a certain number of products. It's steel, iron and steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. So is this a good idea? Well, there are different opinions on this, and at least it's not a quick fix. So how does the CBAM work? So as always, design is everything. So if you are importing steel, aluminium, or some other CBAM products to the EU, you have to pay a tariff. More precisely, you have to buy certificates, one certificate for every ton of emissions that was released when you were producing this product. So if you are, for instance, importing steel, you have to pay for the emissions in the production of steel. And the price of these certificates is the same as the price, or will be the same as the price of CO2 in the EU emission trading system. But then there are some questions. So first of all, which emissions should you count? Should you look at the emissions that really took place at the factory that produced this steel that you're importing? Or should you rather use some product benchmark? Looking, for instance, at the average emission intensity of producing steel, the average emission intensity of producing aluminum, etc. So the EU has chosen the first one, so they will look at the individual firm producing this steel, taking it to EU. Of course, this can be administratively difficult. You need to verify these emissions, but still that's what the EU is planning. But there will be a default for the companies that are not able to verify their emissions. Another important question is, should you only account for the emissions taking place at the factory, or should you also account for the indirect emissions taking place, for instance, for the electricity that you use when producing steel or especially aluminium? This is much more complicated. The EU Commission initially wanted to only start with the direct emissions at the factory, but the Parliament wanted to also include indirect emissions from electricity. But they left it to the Commission to decide how to deal with this. There are many challenges with CBAM, and one is exactly about these indirect emissions, because these emissions are both very important but also difficult to deal with. So this figure shows sort of the life cycle emissions of different product groups in non-OECD and OECD on average. So in the middle you see non-ferrous metals, and the lower part of the bar shows the direct emissions, the emissions taking place at the factory. And then we have the green one on top of that are the indirect emissions from electricity. And you see that these indirect emissions, especially for non-ferrous metals like aluminium, is much more important than the direct emissions. There are also many other challenges which I don't have time to go into. One important is related to export, because the CBAM is only protecting on the import side, and not if you're exporting product out of Europe. Then you're not protecting by the CBAM. There are challenges related to WTO. Will there be a trade war? There may be distributional concerns for developing countries exporting to the EU. Will there be relocation down the value chain, etc.? So we can come back to this in the panel later. Are there any upsides? Yes. So according to most of the research that has been done, shows that carbon border adjustment is a more cost-effective way to deal with carbon leakage than free allowances, especially if you combine carbon tariffs with export rebates. Maybe it will induce other countries to also implement carbon prices. That, of course, will be a very good thing. And at least it will level the playing field inside Europe for the products that are covered by the CBAM. So I think my time is out, so thank you. I look forward to the panel talk.
Thank you so much, Knut Einar.